My name is William Donahue, and this is my Project 1 for Introduction to Plant Science on grain amaranth. So, kind of want to start out today with why is grain amaranth important, or like what is this crop that you're talking about? So grain amaranth is a pseudo-cereal that's used in a lot of different food components. In a lot of ways it's still a niche component in a lot of those foods, but it can be used in bread, bread replacements, it can be a coagulating agent, it can be used in like pasta salads, so it has a lot of functionality. And it also has a little bit of functionality in terms of like popped grains and like integrating more whole grains into your diet as well. It can also be used in a couple of different cover cropping situations, which we'll talk about later on in the presentation. And kind of getting into where we're going, one of the main gaps with the uses of amaranth is that there are a lot of production issues that are still kind of getting the kinks worked out of them. And there's a lot of gaps in market development in terms of making sure people are interested in eating amaranth, because it's not like a normal grain, it's a little bit different. So we're going to talk about all of that today, but that is what grain amaranth is. And so the reason that I haven't said a species yet is because grain amaranth, the normal production species are a combination of 3 different species, and that is Amaranthus crensis, Amaranthus hypochondricus, and Amaranthus caudatus. And so a lot of grain amaranth species that are in production right now are hybridized versions of those 3 different species, and include genetic components from all 3 of those species. The main cultivar that's in production right now in Midwest systems is called Plainsman, and it is a hypochondricus variety, mainly with I think a little bit of crensis and hybridized into that program. It was developed at Nebraska State University, so that kind of gives you some context about where this crop is important. It's mostly a supplemental crop in some Midwestern cropping systems. So in the Amaranthus species family, there's about 80 different species ranging from tropical to temperate. And of those amaranth species that are closely related, they have a lot of different applications. There's a couple of different amaranths that are used for vegetable leaf production. There are some ornamental varieties, such as levelized bleeding, which is kind of like a long beaded variety of amaranth. The vegetable leaf production, that one is called Amaranth tricolor or Joseph's coat. It kind of looks like coleus almost, but it's used for a lot of those applications. And then some of you might even be familiar with some of the weed species that are amaranth, and those are things like Palmer amaranth or pigweed. And so those have also been really prevalent in agricultural systems, but in a totally different way. So kind of an introduction to what amaranth is botanically. So botanically, amaranth is classified as a pseudo-cereal crop. A couple of other pseudo-cereals would be things like quinoa. Think about things that are not grasses, but they produce that grain head that is really beneficial and is used for a lot of different applications. We're going to continue to talk about that. It is a broadleaf annual crop with C4 photosynthesis capacity, so that makes it really temperature and drought resistant, which is kind of what lends itself to it having almost like weed-like habits, which is where you get like Palmer amaranth and pigweed from. They're very drought resistant. They can kind of find the niches in the ecosystem and fill them out. So as the grain amaranth, the different variety, also has a lot of those temperature and drought tolerance traits, which is actually really beneficial when we talk about like climate change. It has really short growing periods because it's the annual. It has a really great upright habit, so like I think they grow 6 to 9 feet tall with large seed heads and high reproduction rates. If you've ever walked up to amaranth, like a Palmer amaranth, and like rubbed your fingers in the seed head, you'll see like tons of really, really small seeds fall out, especially when it's kind of near maturity. So the same thing happens with grain amaranth. It has a lot of really, really, really small seeds. It has a high protein content, a high antioxidants, high critical amino acids such as lysine, and it can be used as a gluten-free component. So those are kind of looking at it nutritionally, but it has a lot of really beneficial things in that aspect. It is normally self-seeding. A lot of kind of the more native populations of amaranth in Mesoamerica are self-seeding and they reoccur in the environment. And even some cover cropping situations will have that system going on. They have a continuous seed head development with maturity, harvest in late fall, and the flowering is not usually triggered by photoperiod, but it can be triggered by photoperiod if you're growing in the fall season. The history, amaranth was grown in Mesoamerica to start out with, and so it was a really popular staple crop for the Aztec culture, and that was along with corns, beans, and gourds. It lost the use in mainstream diets after European influence came to Mesoamerica, and so there's some ideas about why that might have happened. One of the ideas is that a lot of amaranth was actually used in sculptures to pagan gods, and as people in Europe came, they did not like that, and they banned amaranth. And it is really popular in kind of those traditional markets in Mesoamerica and in organic and health premium markets today. That's kind of where we stand with amaranth today. So in Mesoamerica, it has both temperate and tropical varieties, kind of ranging in between, and has a lot of different applications in terms of cropping systems in a lot of those more traditional agroecological systems. So that includes intercropping, so they'll grow amaranth with corn or with other different crops kind of spaced in between. It also can function as a border row, kind of promoting pollinators, promoting ecological benefits. And then it can also be a monoculture for grain production. Temperate Mexican grain is the most popular, which is kind of Hypochondricus, like that variety. It is semi-temperate. It grows in semi-temperate grassland conditions and really benefits from well-drained, developed soil structure, which is kind of what you find in upper Midland Mesoamerica. The main method of propagation for amaranth is absolutely seed. Again, kind of going back to that seed head, there are tons of seeds on one amaranth plant, and it has a really, really high grain production, even comparable to rice or corn in some scenarios, depending on the types of grains and the quality of grain that you're looking for. Since it has that high seed production, it's not really beneficial to vegetatively propagate it or do any other specialized type of propagation. Usually that propagation happens on a 30-inch row spacing at about a half-inch depth because they're such small seeds. They need to be really close to the surface to be able to trigger not photosynthesis, but trigger germination. And because it's an annual species, that germination is going to be triggered by light and warmth or warmth, things along those lines. Optimum planting is in June if you want to get the highest yields, but those adjustments can happen depending on what the system needs. So we talk about production systems. Cropping systems very, very closely mirror that of sorghum, which is a grass-based like cereal crop. So a lot of the same agricultural practices that go into sorghum systems are used in amaranth systems in Nebraska and Oklahoma and places like that. It is grown with conventional grain equipment, so anything that you would use for a lot of those more traditional grain scenarios you would use for amaranth as well. There's a little bit of adjustment, learning curve, because the seeds are a little bit smaller than even most normal grains. So it typically grows in fertile, well-drained soils. The yield of amaranth is typically tied directly in a direct relationship with nutrients and water, but for the most part, it's pretty resilient. And so rain-fed agriculture systems is normally what grain is produced under. There is no herbicide labeled for amaranth. Even though one of the main issues that we face with amaranth is competition with weeds, because it's also a weedy species. There is no herbicide label, so that makes it a little bit difficult, and you have to be very particular about what kind of weed management you choose. So typically that's going to look like cultivation in between the rows, or ridge tilling, which is kind of supporting the plant throughout the species, and it's kind of a combination of cultivation as well. But that's supporting the plant stalks more strongly. When we look at insects, the tarnished plant bug is really the only main insect species, which is analogous, and it can diminish grain quality, but most of the time pyrethroids are usually pretty reliable and are approved for use in grain systems. And the other kind of big issue we're going to continue to look at here in production systems is high seedling mortality, again because it's such a fast, small seeding annual, a lot of issues can come in on initial germination. So some issues with production that happen, threshing and post-harvest issues are a big one because you have such small seeds and irregular seed head shapes, as you've kind of seen in some of the pictures today. And so because of that, there's a lot of issues with getting that grain at a high enough quality and without any of the flour parts, but just the grain right out of the field. So there's a lot of post-harvest processing that it has to go through. There is a weedy habit of this crop, so if you were to grow it in one season, it's probably going to come up the next season, which is a huge issue because you don't want amaranth growing, and competing with a crop the next season, especially if it's a cash crop or something that might be more economically valuable. There is a lot of high labor input into weed competition management. Weed competition is kind of the main thing that causes the limiting agent here, and so a lot of the times hand weeding can be a component, especially in organic systems. And then also there's a lot of labor input into a hilling practice. So because amaranths are so top heavy, they have that large seed head on the top, they can lodge and fall over, especially in different weather conditions. And so that's a huge issue, and they will hill up the dirt around the stalks to make sure that they prevent lodging or falling over. There's a couple issues with crop spacing, mostly just inconsistent results overall. And so whenever they do research on amaranth and grain amaranth, they get really inconsistent data in terms of fertilizer, in terms of spacing, genetic variation, seeding techniques. There's a lot of different research that's out there about grain amaranth, but there's not a lot of scientific consensus about where to move with grain amaranth. And also the next one we kind of talked about already is extreme weather failure. So if there are high winds, if there is a major weather event, then most of the time amaranth is going to fall over and you can lose a large amount of production very quickly. So we talk about real world examples. A lot of the real world examples are going on in either organic agriculture or in Mesoamerican systems. And so one of the big ones, and in an interview from NPR, talks about the Minerva Cruz farm in Oaxaca, Mexico. Forgive me if I pronounced that wrong. But basically just talks about this farm. They're doing monocultures of amaranth grown in conventional field settings. And they have a couple gaps in production we already kind of talked about. Their main ones are threshing and post-harvest, which is a huge issue, and the weed habit. It's reoccurring when they try to use it as a cover crop, or whenever they try to have something the next season, it's interfering with the next season, which is a huge issue. This specific farm is part of a nonprofit coalition that is government funded, and it focuses on the human and cultural element of agroecosystems. So being that Mesoamerica kind of has this cultural tie to amaranth, they're trying to bring it back in and reincorporate it, especially since they have a lot of traditional meals. And some of those social issues in Mexican society that this farm specifically is looking to use amaranth for are obesity and food security independent of international trade. Especially with even political issues like NAFTA. Mexico is looking at developing their own independent agricultural system in case of some kind of international conflict. So we talk about Gainesville, and yes, absolutely, amaranth can be grown in Gainesville. Most of the time that's going to look like some type of ornamental variety that has a grain application, because you're probably going to be growing it in your home garden if you were to grow it individually. When we talk about a theoretical production situation, amaranth, especially the grain amaranth varieties and the grain amaranth family, are mostly going to be used in some type of organic or agroecological system instead of large mainstream production. We also just don't have a lot of grain production in Florida in general, and so we would probably integrate that into some type of short season end crop because it can grow so quickly. And if you were looking to have a quick turnaround on an annual crop, you had like an awkward 3-month gap, then you could grow amaranth because it has continuous growth. So you can grow it for as long as you want to, and then you can cut it down. And for some species, they have like a very distinct amount of time they have to be grown for, but amaranth's a little bit more flexible because its seed head develops over time, and that grain is going to develop over time. So you can cut it down a month in and have a lot less grain, but you'll still have something. So that's kind of an application of it that would be for here in Gainesville, especially since we have a lot of kind of organic community in Gainesville that could really use that. And I'm pretty sure that there are organic situations. I've been to one recently that was growing a variety of amaranth. I think ornamentally, but it could also be integrated into more of the food system side. There are some small local markets and kind of those niche markets that still need a lot of development, and so that's definitely, Gainesville would be an optimal place for that kind of environment. And here are my resources, and thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.